Well, I'm here with Mike Squires of King's College London, but we're in Berlin, so do you want to tell us why we're in Berlin?
Right, we're both skiving here in Berlin in different ways. I'm at this thing called the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, so it's the Institute of Advanced Studies, or kind of knowledge college, as some people affectionately call it. Yeah, and the idea is to bring together a group of different fellows each year and give them some space to do their own work.
And what is it that you're working on?
So I'm working on a project to do with Philostratus' Imagines. It's a bit of a mouthful, but Philostratus was a 3rd century AD Greek author. So he's writing in the period sometimes called the Second Sophistic, so under the Roman Empire. And the Imagines is just one of his many works, and it's a description of a set of paintings. Mm-hmm. It's in 2 books, and it describes some 65 tableau paintings. And I'm interested in what this work can tell us about much larger questions of viewing and interpretation in the ancient world at large.
Mm-hmm. And what are these images?
So these images are drawn from all manner of different subjects. Some of them are mythological, some of them are geographical, some of them are what we would call still lives.
Yeah.
But they're drawn from all manner of different subjects and brought together in this gallery. And one of the main questions that's been directed about the Imagines ever since they were first translated into Latin and made famous in the Western post-Renaissance world is whether this gallery is a real gallery or a rhetorical construction.
I see. So what do you think is going on here? What's really the purpose of having this virtual gallery?
Yeah, well, for me, the question about authenticity is revealing in as much as Philostratus has it both ways.
Right.
So Philostratus has his reader thinking about whether or not these could be real images, thinking about whether they're just rhetorical constructions, but not giving any answers. And so for me, the very debate of this question, are they real, are they not real, is itself a kind of a deep ground response to the playfulness, the fictitiousness, I guess we'd say, of the text. It's very questions of what you can do with images and what you can do with their descriptions.
So what can you do with images? What does Philostratus do?
Well, Philostratus gets us thinking about precisely what the limits are. And I guess one nice example is the very first description. There's a description of Scamander, so it's taken from towards the end of the Iliad. And all we know about this picture from the beginning of the description is that we see a river on fire.
So this is the moment in the Iliad where Achilles has slaughtered all the Trojans. Scamander, the Trojan river, rises up and challenges him, and Achilles has to be saved by Hephaestus, god of fire.
Exactly right. Yeah. So there's a whole literary backdrop here, which is being brought into play. But Philostratus' question is, what could you see in a picture of this that you couldn't see in a text?
Right.
So one of the first things he does is say, well, what you see here is a river on fire. Isn't this crazy? Right? Aren't you lost in wonder and marvel at this picture?
Yeah.
And then he says, well, to understand it, you have to look away from the picture. And he says explicitly, look away from the picture and look at the text. Look back to Homer.
Right.
And then he tells us the story as told by Homer, and then he tells us to look back at the picture. But even as he tells us to look back at the picture, he recounts that picture in a series of verbal allusions to the Iliadic text. So I guess Philostratus' game here is that any image of this, any visual imagination of this episode is intrinsically linked to the description of the text.
And I guess also the other thing that's going on here is that you're being asked to kind of look at the image and then look away from the image and then look back with this text. And the only thing you have are Philostratus' words.
Absolutely
you don't
right.
actually have the image.
So the whole game here with Philostratus is played out on a meta level, if you like, in that he's addressing a make-believe boy within this gallery, right? But he also knows full well, with a kind of twinkle in his eye, that he's addressing us as readers. And we as readers are looking upon a scene of explanation, of interpretation, where we're told we can look at the pictures. The boy is told to look carefully, look, have a look, see what's happening here.
Yeah.
But of course, all along, all we have are the opacity of the words before us.
Right.
So I guess there is at stake here a much larger question about what it means to see or what it means to view. And one way of contextualising this whole project is in light of rhetorical discussions of what was called ecphrasis in the Imperial Greek world.
What does ecphrasis
So ecphrasis literally means speaking out, literally means a speaking out, an expressiveness. And it's theorised by these rhetoricians in terms of what they call bringing about seeing through hearing, or rather almost bringing about seeing through hearing. And it's that almost that's very much a concern to Philostratus. But what these guys are getting at in their rhetorical discussions of ecphrasis is the way in which a speech could summon up a series of pictures, the ways in which a visual entity could be made present before our eyes through the vividness, the Greek word's energeia, through the vividness of its description.
So it's a work of art within a work of art. Yeah, now I guess a classic example, the first that we have at least, is the Achilles' shield in the Iliad.
Absolutely right, yeah. So the earliest example of the so-called ecphrasis, I guess, would be all the way back in the archaic Greek literary tradition of Homer. And if you look not to the Philostratus that I'm interested in, but rather to his grandson, who's also called Philostratus, and also writes a book of Imagines, you'll actually find within this gallery a description of the Homeric.
So he has his own gallery, and in this gallery he has a description of Philostratus.
Absolutely right, yeah. And of course there the games of sort of ekphrastic recession and replication are played out therefore, because what we see here, or rather what we read here, is a text describing a painting drawn after the text of Homer drawn out of the shield. So we have this kind of game of image to text, that's drawn out within this imaginary ecphrasis, but knows full well that all we have to go on in imagining what this picture might be like is the words, the text in front of us.
So it gets quite dizzying.
It gets dizzying,
This play on how you describe the absent picture. Yeah,
sometimes you need to go and lie down in a dark room and then come back to it once again. But it's very much that complexity, that ludicness of the text that's of interest to me. So the way in which Philostratus takes, if you like, the entire Greek literary tradition and summons it up through a series of paintings, but asking all of these much deeper ontological questions about what painting is, says it explicitly, what is the painting, and getting us thinking about what we can do with words that we can't do with images, and what we could potentially do with images that we can't do with words. Yeah. Where do we draw the boundaries, the parameters between visual experience and verbal experience?
And what kind of gallery does he conjure up, actually?
So in total we have some 65 tableaus. We have a gallery made up of all of these different tableaus. Sometimes there are connections between them, sometimes not. And this for me is another much larger question about how you put together the parts. So should you read this gallery just as a series of fragments, as a series of tableaux, or should you try and put all of these parts together?
And what difference that makes when you read something in isolation and when you read something against something else?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you think about the question from a philological, literary point of view, then you could think about all manner of prototypes here. So you could think, I guess the best example would be an anthology of epigrams. So a poetic anthology that has all of these single individual entities, but also asks you as a reader to think about the collective whole. Right? I mean, we could give all manner of think about Roman poetry, Horace, for example, or think about Roman prose, for that matter, right? Books of epistles, like Cicero or Pliny. The way in which the anthology gets you thinking about meaning on a collective level. But of course, you could also think about the question of the gallery as an entity from an archaeological or art historical point of view. And we know full well that in the Pompeian world, in the Roman world generally, you have all of these sorts of galleries that play very knowingly and self-consciously with juxtapositions that make you think about what it means to view a particular image of one particular myth alongside an image of another, gets you to think about connections between the framed tableau displayed alongside each other in a single room. So for me, Philostratus' gallery here, as a collective entity, plays out a game that's witnessed both in a philological sense, but also in a historical sense.
And of course, even in today's modern world, how you put on an exhibition, just the framing the individual work of art and its relationship to everything else in the gallery is just so important. It changes the way you think about something.
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, we have different frameworks of thinking about collections, don't we? One frequent way of displaying paintings is in terms of chronology. But also, you think about something like, all manner of examples could be given, where you come up with a thematic idea, and then you put together paintings that play with that idea in different ways alongside each other. So that idea of collection and individual tableau is also important to me. But I guess for me the ultimate question is about image and text, and the way in which Philostratus' gallery asks questions that pertain equally to a visual sphere as to a verbal literary sphere.
And the 65 paintings, are they all... You've given the example so far of the river in the Iliad, so are all of these images based somehow in some kind of textual reality?
So texts play a crucial part here. One of the games that Philostratus plays is taking set moments of literature and visualising them, or rather visualising them only to verbalise them once more in his descriptions. But I guess one way of contextualising this would be in terms of the second sophistic as a whole. One of the characteristics of the second sophistic is that it expresses this huge concern with the whole and the entirety of the Greek literary past. Very self-conscious idea, playing with that past in all sorts of different ways. So you have Homer, but alongside Homer you have all sorts of unlikely-looking writers. You have Xenophon, famously, image 2.9 in the Imagines is a description of Panthea that cites Xenophon explicitly. But you also have, for example, Sappho, you have Euripides, you have Aeschylus. You have all manner of different writers brought together in an anthology that's at once a visual entity, a gallery, but also, as it were, an anthology or an encyclopedia of the entire Greek literary past.
That's interesting. And are there any other kind of notable figures from Homer that get taken out of context, or put into different contexts?
Yeah, Homer looms large throughout the Imagines, often cited and said, think about Homer, he tells you this story, but often uncited. In fact, you have lots of these so-called hapax legomena, so sort of words that you only find in Homer once, right? So kind of very specific philological geeky words that find their way into the Imagines in very unlikely-looking settings. But you also have tableaux that combined Homeric subjects, or Homeric themes, with non-Homeric themes, or rather tableaux that bring together Homer with all sorts of other literary writers. So one example would be the description of Polyphemus in Book 2.
Okay, the Cyclops.
The Cyclops, yeah. So you have, the description starts off with a series of citations, allusions to Homer, to the story in Odyssey Book 9 about Odysseus and the Cyclops. But then
he's the bad guy.
Exactly.
Cyclops
is the dreadful guy with a single eye that eats his guests.
Yes, that's not a good host.
Not what you're meant to do. But in this particular description, we start off with Homer, but then the description then shifts to Theocritus and to his 11th Idyll. And what the description does is begin by making us think that what's going to come is a whole story about Odysseus and the Cyclops, but then suddenly shifts in the middle, changes, becomes a story about the younger Polyphemus, who's desperately in love with Galatea.
This is from Theocritus.
So
the image changes before your eyes.
Absolutely right. And I guess we should say here that distinction's a bit more blurred than perhaps I've made out, in as much as Homer looms large for Theocritus, right? So you can't make a strict distinction between Homer Odyssey 9 and Theocritus Idyll 11. But nevertheless, it seems to me that kind of cross-literary generic play is symptomatic of a larger conceit and game in the Imagines at large.
And this is something that words are doing. The words are changing the image. So the image, the kind of the mental image that you're constructing from reading these words is changing in a way that perhaps a painting couldn't do.
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So one of the things that the Imagines does is to evoke all sorts of things that you could never picture.
Yes.
Right? So impossibilities, things that are beyond visual representation. In the Imagines you have, for example, pictures that talk, that sound, that make noises. You have pictures that smell, right? And we have several evocations where the writer, or rather the speaker says, you can almost smell those roses, right? Or reach out and pick the berries or the fruits of one of his still lifes, so you could almost eat them. You have pictures that have that respond to touch, prickly things.
Right.
So they appeal to all of the five senses, not just to the sense of sight.
And that's interesting because that reminds me of the Shield of Achilles, where Homer described the act of ploughing. And so even in Homer, you get a sense of this ecphrasis is shifting all the time, and it can't be kind of captured or pinned down in a single image.
Yeah, yeah. And Homer is the prime example here of starting a tradition of thinking about the evocation of artworks in non-visual terms. Or rather, one of the things that's very striking when you read that ecphrasis in Book 18 of the Iliad is the number of sounds that you hear. So you hear cows mooing, you hear songs within the song, you hear people talking, you hear people shouting, debating, and you even hear silence. Right? It's this wonderful moment where you have the king sitting silently. All of these things are heard within the picture, which begins this tradition of thinking about the boundaries or parameters between vision and voice. Later on in the 6th century, Simonides would say that so we hear from later sources, would say that poetry is like a talking picture, and picture is like a silent poem. But already you have that at once analogy and disparity between sight and sound already there in the Homeric ecphrasis.